Uh, Again, thank you for hosting this. And we know that the title of the series is called 2020, A Year Without Public Space Under the COVID-19 Pandemic. So we saw these images that were also shown here in terms of how we suddenly had a loss of public space in terms of occupancy around the world. But I think as things unfold, we started to see that this contraction of public space or this sort of emptying of public space was only one narrative. And in many cases, there was a different kind of adjustment or adaptation, and in cases, an expansion. So this little presentation here is going to be more about a positive on the street life and the impact of the pandemic in a more optimistic way in going forward. So here are some images from a city called Cincinnati, Ohio.
Sorry, Vikas. Yeah, we do not see your presentation. Can you try again to share the screen, please?
Sure, I'll try again.
It was visible before, but it disappeared.
Yes. Yeah, and when you put it in full screen mode, it disappeared.
Do you see it now or you don't?
Yes, yes, we can see now. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, so that's the first slide in any case. Yes, so we've seen this contraction and we saw many of these images. These are just some images from Cincinnati in Ohio in the US, sort of mid-sized city in the Midwest. And as we know, all of the formal public spaces are closed. There is barely anybody there. There is sort of emptying of these large celebrated public spaces of cities. Are sort of other public spaces as institutions, like the libraries, are closed. Even the ones that are open are deserted. And there is virtually sort of no street life in where we typically accept or expect street life. At the same time, there is an expansion on the way happening in sort of what is called by sociologists a parochial space. So in the neighborhoods, you see a sudden change in behavior in terms of people trying to occupy their own spaces outside, many of which are private or neighborhood spaces, which are public. And you see all kinds of behaviors of interaction because there is really not much of the larger public spaces that are open. This expansion is not only in neighborhoods that have, in this case, fair amount of space, green space, but also in the inner city where the streets are actively used for casual socializing, for play. And it's very interesting to watch the dramatic change in the same city for occupancy in terms of the public space. So this change or this expansion brings about a very different kind of phenomena, particularly in the context of US cities, that this adaptation also brings an expansion of agency. So a large amount of public spaces that I showed earlier are extremely programmed, are extremely sort of held up by institutional structures that are often sort of held up by other structures which are very neoliberal, the public-private partnerships and a lot of private money. But once we are shunning these hyper-designed, themed, programmed sort of private or quasi-public spaces, like in this case, the malls, what is becoming clearer is how we are transforming spaces that are certainly managed, but they are not programmed in any way by a lot of the agencies. So what happens is the agency is getting transferred to the people in their ability to use, interpret, and sort of occupy these public spaces, which is a very interesting phenomena in the US because everything is sort of guided, but not particularly agency transferred to the common public. So this space has now been left in many ways raw and unembellished. And that is an opportunity for citizens to particularly try and do what they would like to do with public space. And again, these may not seem unusual sort of behaviors in most cities around the world, but in the US, these kinds of behaviors where you occupy the street and sort of take over is very, very interesting. And the use of streets by children is a great example of how this reinterpretation or adaptation of space is showing us our ability in terms of freedom, invention, and creative play, not only spatially, but also temporally, because now if children are occupying these spaces closer to home, they are able to do that for much longer time. And it's not only children, it's people, how they are occupying the streets, how they are interacting with each other, where they are interacting with each other is particularly interesting. So in other ways, if you want to see and think about this spatially, there is a typological switch from these spaces being vacated, but other spaces being occupied, which have always been there. So we see, people running, jogging in the middle of the streets, people taking more to natural spaces for getting the exercises they need. If you look at the picture here, the benches stay unused, but people start to occupy space in a way where they are taking the agency. And the most interesting to me is this wall where people said, okay, if programmed sport is unavailable, we can actually start to interpret that. And this is all happening in one mid-sized city. So it's very interesting to see how other spaces that are available begin to get used. Finally, I think the case here is a modest case for thinking about the future, particularly in places, in cities in the US where public health is a huge concern, not only in terms of physical health, but perhaps more importantly in terms of psychological health, that we are a society that doesn't particularly interact the way that many other places in the world do. And we see more and more sort of rise in terms of just the emotional stress on people in their sort of lockdown conditions. And there is a hope that while this is not a time to romanticize the current situation, we want to go back to work and to learn and to socialize and go to our leisure spaces. There are lots of opportunities in terms of public spaces becoming a part for public health, but different kind of public spaces. Perhaps these are spaces that, like I said earlier, are parochial public spaces that are less programmed, that are less managed, that have the ability to provide the agency to the people themselves to then reinterpret public spaces. So the idea that this availability of space that is around us can be put to use for other sort of public interactions may be a sort of a future for cities like this. So there's the argument is that there is a vast amount of parochial space, which is public, in residential neighborhoods, whether they are parks, play areas, community gardens, and more importantly, residential streets. And we might not consider these to be the foremost for political action, but these are spaces that are, in fact, have the ability to create a social glue and to live healthier lives. And the hope is that this contraction, which is leading to an expansion in different place, can be adapted and it might generate an augmented public space. Thank you.